Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another Pioneer Deep Deck dive, this time with mono blue spirits in the format. A few of you have asked for this in some of the other videos, so I figured we'd give it a go, take a look at the deck, take a look at the key pieces, and see how the deck performs in the format overall. So this is a blue tempo deck that is based around the card Curious Obsession and cheap flyers and counterspells. A lot of your creatures are interchangeable as far as what they do, but the main thing is Curious Obsession. Whenever a enchanted creature gets +1/+1, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. Beginning your end step, if you didn't attack with a creature this turn, sacrifice Curious Obsession. This is your primary source of card advantage throughout the early and mid games. Allows you to kind of get the snowball rolling where you drop a creature on turn 1, equip this on turn 2, protect it with something, either a Slip Out the Back, a Dive Down, a Spell Pierce on turn 2. From whatever your opponent has, and you kind of snowball from there, often playing a flash game and disrupting your opponent's relevant spells and then killing them quickly as possible while your conditional counter spells are in play. To that end, you do have the suite of creatures, starting with Ascendant Spirit, which is a 1/1 for 1 that you can pump with different snow mana. 2 snow mana makes it a 2/3, 3 snow mana makes it a 4/4 with flying, and then for each pump of 4 beyond that, you put 2 +1/+1 counters. This creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and that does stack. And then Curious Obsession we've already talked about. Mausoleum Wonder is a way to protect some of your other creatures, and it grows as you play other spirits. It's a 1/1 that comes into play whenever another spirit enters the battlefield, gets +1/+1 until end of turn. You can sacrifice Mausoleum Wonder to counter a target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller plays X, where X is Mausoleum Wanderer's power. You can do a lot of tricks with this and playing your spirits at instant speed, to pump it up, make your opponent not be able to play around the tax ability on it. And then the final 1-drop spirit is Spectral Sailor, which is a 1/1 with flash. You can pay 3 and a blue to draw a card. This is an excellent mana sink in the mid to late game as you're kind of getting to the grindier parts of the game and maybe you run out of gas. Other creatures, including Supreme Phantom, which is the lord for this particular motley crew. You have Shacklegeist, which is a 2/2 flyer that whenever you can tap 2 spirits you control to tap target creature you don't control. Then you have Rattle Chains, which is a 2/1 spirit that you can play with flash. Whenever it comes into play, target spirit gains hexproof until end of turn, and then your other spirits all gain flash. And then the final one in this particular list is Brazen Borrower. Even though it's not a spirit, it is a 2-for-1 here with Petty Theft and having a flash flyer. And then you have various counter spells and ways to protect your creatures, things like Spell Pierce that obviously counters target non-creature spell unless its controller plays 2. You have Lofty Denial, which counter target spell unless its controller plays 1. Unless you control a creature with flying, that's 4 instead. But the main one you see play in this deck is Gaslight Snare. Gaslight Snare is 2 and a blue, but this costs 1 less if you control a spirit and 1 less if you control an enchantment. So if you have a creature suited up with Curious Obsession, it only costs 1. And then it's counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. Beyond that, you have other protection spells, things like Slip Out the Back, which puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It phases out. And most notably with this ability, it does keep Curious Obsession whenever it comes back into play. And then beyond that, you're just kind of running different sets of permission, different sets of protection. You have 4 copies of Faithless Haven in both these builds, as you are a mono blue deck, so you can take advantage of the snow creature land, and then 1 copy of Odawaru as a way to balance problematic permanents, especially planeswalkers, creatures, artifacts, or enchantments. Sideboard is kind of a mismatch. Being a mono blue deck, you don't have a ton of card removal or anything. So instead you're playing things like Entrancing Melody to steal your opponent's creatures. It's X into blue, gain control of target creature for mana value X. Notably, you do that permanently. Mystical Dispute when you're playing against any type of blue decks, especially control decks, when you need cheap counterspells to protect your creatures. And when Counterspell Wars, Ether Gust for any type of blue or green deck, so things like mono red, things like mono green. You can also bring this in against Monoda when it was a thing. So this is very much a card that sees quite a bit of play in the format, mainly now against mono red aggro and mono green devotion. And then Disdainful Stroke for any type of big mana you're playing against, mostly against ramp decks, and some control decks. Unlicensed Hearse when you're playing against any type of graveyard nonsense, whether it be against the Greasefang decks in particular, or any other deck that might utilize its graveyard, like Izzet Phoenix. Dive Down, another protection spell, gives your creature hexproof and +0/+3. And then Witness Protection, enchanted creature loses all abilities, and a green and white citizen creature with base power and toughness 1/1 named Legitimate Business Person. It's the closest that mono blue comes to hard removal. Taking a look at this list, not really a whole lot going on here different. You are running more copies of Lofty Denial on this list as opposed to the copies of Slip Out the Back. You have more copies of Brazen Borrower as well. But this one's only running 21 lands as opposed to this one here was running 22. So whether you want to run 21, 22 lands, how many Faceless Havens you want to run. As far as the sideboard, cards that I wanted to point out was Cerulean Drake. This is an excellent protection from red creature. It's flying protection from red, sacrifice Cerulean Drake, counter target spell that targets you. Quite a nice ability packed in one thing. And then the other card that I wanted to point out was Icon of Ancestry. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control get +1/+1. 3 in tab, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from the chosen type among them and put it in your hand, with the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is kind of a nice way to get some card advantage in kind of the grindier games, particularly against control, and especially Izzet variety decks, which tend to have like the necessary cheap interaction, especially with the red-based variety, or mono. A little bit less against mono red, as mono red's more of a racing situation, but it is nice against kind of the mid-range red-based decks like Izzet and such. Once again, taking a look, seeing a lot of the same different things. These decks don't have a lot of variety in terms of what they're playing, although there is a lot of variation on numbers. The one I wanted to point out in this one is Weathered Runestone. Non-land permanent cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. This is mainly for the Greasefang decks, as things like Grafdigger's Cage don't stop the artifacts from coming back into play. It also says players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries, so this also randomly shuts down things like Bring to Light out of Niv, etc. But this is a very powerful card, particularly for any type of graveyard shenanigans you might be facing. The Rakdos decks, the various different Greasefang decks, etc. And then, additional copy of Icon of Ancestry besides the one in the main deck. So a lot of things here, wearing up whether you want to. Do you want to hedge against the red decks? Do you want to hedge against the graveyard decks? Do you want to hedge against the grindy control decks? This deck is flexible in what it does, although we'll get into a second kind of what its weak points are and kind of how you can attack the deck. Finally, a couple different things that are in this list that we haven't seen previously. One of Narset's Reversal, very good in Counterspell Wars, also very good in against random things like Thought Distortion out of Lotus Field combo. And then another one I wanted to point out was Unsubstantiate. This is both a return target spell or return target or spell or creature to its owner's hand. This list is from a list a little bit older. It's from a list about a month old from Pascal Menard, but I thought it was interesting to point out these cards. And then a one of copy of Fading Hope here as a way to either protect your creatures or get an annoying creature out of your way. There is a lot of different interactive pieces you can do in a cheap mono blue deck. The main thing with mono blue is it is a deck that wants to get ahead and stay ahead, especially with Curious Obsession. Now, all of its draws are not going to have Curious Obsession, plus protection on two. So, this deck does have some nearly unbeatable starts in a lot of matchups, but on the other hand, it's not unbeatable. The best way to beat it is generally with cheap removal, especially of the red-based variety. It does not have a lot of power and toughness in these decks, so oftentimes Blessed Bolt and stuff will be enough to get the job done against a lot of the creatures. And overall, the best way to interact with it is just a bunch of cheap removal in the early turns, keeping them from getting the ball rolling. And then in the mid to late game, have some way to pull ahead. You want to keep their card advantage engines from going. So mainly you want to keep Spectral Sailor off the battlefield in the late game. You want to keep Curious Obsession off the battlefield as much as possible. And then you can kind of one-for-one your way through what this deck is doing. Now, things you don't want to be doing in this deck, you don't want to be trying to cast expensive instant sorceries, planeswalkers, that kind of stuff. This deck kind of feeds on the mid-range and control matchups, especially the clunky control matchups like blue-white control. Obviously, Supreme Verdict does clear up all the things, and blue-white does have a lot of tools, but blue-white is also a good bit more clunky than something like Izzet. Izzet is probably one of its worst matchups overall, right up there with Mono Red being a rough matchup, hence why you see things like Cerulean Drake and Aethergust in a lot of these builds. Historically, when this deck was in Standard, the way you kind of beat it was with other aggressive decks, or maybe a step above in terms of pressure what it does. But it all starts with cheap interaction, whether it be Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, a bunch of black aggressive creatures, you know, a bunch of red removal spells with red creatures, Izzet decks, etc. You know, the cheaper you can be with your interaction, the better off you are. And the decks this feasts on, you know, decks like Lotus Field, decks like Mono Green can be a little bit close because Mono Green can overpower, especially if they can run them out of counter spells. One of the things with this deck is this deck can run out of gas quite quickly if it does not have a Curious Obsession or a Spectral Sailor going. That's why you see the things like Icon of Ancestry. Oftentimes, you know, it'll counter for your first 2 or 3 spells, and if you sequence them correctly and your third spell that you cast happens to be a Haymaker and they can't deal with it, chances are you can kind of stabilize the game and win from there. Or, you know, if you're playing any type of uncounterable spells like 6-mana Chandra out of your sideboard or something, if you can live that long, you know, cards like that can be quite important. You're playing basically anything that's, if you're going to play big spells, they have to be uncounterable and they have to stabilize the game. So it's kind of, if you want to be on the top end of things, you want to be playing a ton of uncounterable stuff, ways to ramp there, get there quickly. You know, that is one strategy you can do, although it's not the most effective. Once again, the most effective against this deck is, you know, early pressure backed up by a cheap disruption, or just get on the board with early aggression like with a mono red deck or cheap aggressive mono green deck. You know, like Elf into 3-drop, force them, you know, to be on the back foot, especially if they're on the draw. You know, this deck is very good on the play and very good against the clunkier decks in the format, and struggles against decks that can kind of match it, you know, speed for speed and kill all its creatures. You know, it has a rough time. That said, it still has some counterplay. You know, it still has some card draw, has Faceless Haven, so this is a deck that does have a lot of counterplay to even to heavy removal decks, but those tend to be the decks that fare best against it. So overall, this is a fairly straightforward deck at what it does, but can be quite challenging to play. It also can be among the most infuriating to play against. You know, people don't generally like having all their spells countered and dying to little blue flyers. So, you know, be prepared that you might tilt some people, especially if you're playing this deck in paper, or even online, whether it be in Pioneer or Explorer. You're definitely going to tilt some people off with this deck. So that said, it can be a blast to play in small doses. I played quite a bit of it when it was in the standard format and enjoyed it. And generally, it's also one of the cheaper decks. I think as far as the Magic Online deck, the only card that was prohibitively expensive was kind of the Unlicensed Hearse. The rest of the deck is fairly cheap. So I'm actually surprised that doesn't see more play, but maybe people don't like to play pattern of the deck. And it is a deck that kind of ebbs and flows as, you know, the aggressive red deck come in the format, or as a decks see, you know, more play, etc. So that said, that's my deep deck dive for Mono Blue Spirits. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know down below what video or what deck you want to see me cover next.